Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In today's video we're going to be talking about Collision 2024, an S Plus year that took place this weekend in Tri-State, and this event was an absolute banger. You had pretty much of all NA's top talent showing up, and it was definitely quite the spectacle. For our top 16 finishers, you got Omega, Sinji, DeBuzz, and Riddles in 13th, Didi, Lima, Peanut, and Zomba in 9th. In 7th, you're going to have Meister and MKLEO. 5th is Light and MUTEACE, 4th is KOLA, 3rd is ONIN, 2nd was SHADIC, and winning the entire thing is Spargo. And let's start by talking about the top 8 seeds that just didn't get into the top 8. The first one is going to be Tweek, and he was the first seed of this event, rightfully so, but he ends up falling at 17th place. In the winner's side, he ends up losing to ONIN, and we knew that that was going to be a problem if he ends up running into ONIN. I thought Tilde would have made that upset, but shouts to ONIN because he looked really good in both of those sets, 3-0ing both players. And in the loser side, Tweek has the misfortune of running into Didi, and he also loses that one 3-0. And before this tournament, I would have told you that the biggest problem for Tweek is Steve, but after this tournament, it's just a fact. He struggles a lot versus this character, and it's not wrong to struggle versus a certain character. Most people in this game have that. Light, for example, he doesn't do super well versus Ice Climbers. It's a bad matchup for Fox. The character's not super common. It's just a tricky one to figure out. But the problem for Tweek is that Ice Climbers is like 1 in every 50 brackets you're going to run to that character. You're probably going to run into a somewhat competent Steve every second bracket. At least that character is super popular, and Tweek needs a solution for it that he just doesn't have right now. And I'm very interested to see what his plan is going to be, because it seems like he wants to solo main Diddy Kong, and honestly that is probably the best choice, at least in my opinion. Solo main is a really good idea right now, and he can play Sephiroth, but he dropped that character for a reason, and the reason is that character sucks. He doesn't like playing Pokemon Trainer anymore, and Cloudy says doesn't really feel enough like Smash 4, where it's just super unorthodox for him, and those are all very valid reasons, but those are really good matchups versus Steve that are off the table, and we're not left with a ton of characters, to be honest. And the only low-ish maintenance character that I can think of would be Corrin. I'm pushing the Corrin narrative again. I know Tweek would be very good on the Corrin. We've seen him have proficiency with other sword characters in the past, and Corrin allows for that combo freedom that you have with a character like Diddy Kong. And a comparison that I really like talking about is Corrin, Diddy Kong, and Bayonetta, because they're all super creative characters, and they all have this really weird side B that give them a massive burst range, but they all do different things. Diddy Kong is going to give you the best movement with Monkey Flip as well as a command grab. Bayos is going to be a combo tool, and Corrin is going to have a straight up kill option. So the characters are all similar in that aspect of how they can control the mid-range, but that's kind of where the similarities and it doesn't really have anything to do with the point. I just kind of want to bring it up. And basically, to summarize everything, I think Tweek is probably just going to stick it on the Diddy Kong and figure out the matchup, but I do believe he can figure out the matchup, but I would love to see the Corrin. And let's look at our other top 8 seeds. You're going to have Riddles and DeBuzz both finishing in 13th place. And DeBuzz is going to get upset a little bit earlier on by Sinji, and I'll talk about Sinji in just a second. But he manages to make a decent loser run. He beats Swampy to get into the top 32, and once into the top 32, he beats both Monty and Mars before running into MKLEO. And we all know the DeBuzz MKLEO record. That's just kind of a really bad draw, to be honest. And Riddles ends up losing to Meister in the winner's side, and I'll talk about that when I talk about Meister. And in the loser side, he ends up running into Didi, and that's been a matchup that he's honestly struggled a lot with. Didi doesn't really go to any events, but fun fact, every single time Didi has gone to a major, he's played Riddles, which is just very, very funny to me, and I believe he's won all those encounters as well. And then finally, you're going to have Zomba. In the winner's side, he ends up losing to Lima, and that's a bit of a tricky one because prior to this, it was a 2-0 record in Zomba's favor, but Bayonetta Rob is super in Bayo's favor, so it's kind of tough to tell who you'd expect to win that one, but evidently it was supposed to be Lima because he came out on top. Then Zomba beats Atomic, though Atomic does manage to take a Game 5 in the Rob data, so shouts to him for that. Has another Game 5 versus Omega before he ends up running into Light, and he does not win his run back from the Lit Invitational. Those sets are very coin flippy, but Light comes out on top from those past two, and Zomba hasn't been able to repeat that magic that he had at Genesis, but all of his placements are still very good. 5th at Circa and Lit Invitational, and a 9th at Collision are definitely nothing to sneeze at. And straight up, there was not that many upsets at this tournament, at least at the super high level of the game, because going into the top 32 winner's side, there was only 2 players that weren't supposed to be there, and that is Jakal and Sinji. Jakal makes the upset over Didi, and Sinji makes the upset over DeBuzz, like I mentioned, and Jakal ends up losing to SHADIC, getting reverse 3-0'd, but he absolutely could have won that set, and then falls to Omega in the loser side, and Sinji ends up losing to MUTEACE, and I want to talk a little bit more about Sinji's run, because he ends up getting 13th place, beating WebJ WJP once he does get sent to the loser side. And Sinji is low-key a sleeper player for NA right now because he's only been to 2 majors in 2024. One of them was a 9th at LMBM, and now we have a 13th place at Collision. I feel like if we can see this player travel more, he is going to be an explosive talent, and he's in contention for the best Pac-Man in the world. It's really hard for me to give him that title just because T is such a monster, but if he goes to more stuff and keeps performing like this, there's definitely a possibility. And before we get into the top 12, there's 4 players that I want to mention. The first one is going to be Chunky Kong. We talk about him pretty much every tournament he goes to, but that's because he does good at every tournament he goes to. Chunky Kong is one of the most consistent players that we have in America. Collision is his worst major of the season, and he got 25th with solo DK, and he almost made the upset over Light. Highly recommend that you watch this set because it was an absolute banger, and he manages to pick up wins over Chag and Doorstop before falling to WebJP in the loser side. Such an impressive player, and I feel like the second we see him get into a top 8, it is over for everyone else, and I'm very confident it's going to happen at some point, which is something that I never thought I would say. Then you're also going to have Super Semi finishing in 17th place, making his NA debut, and he didn't make as much waves as you may expect, but he still overplaced his seed with an SPR of +2, getting wins over players like Beastly and Rivers, only losing to Zomba and Peemna, and both of those guys ended up getting 9th place at the event. Absolutely world-class players. You're going to have Atomic. I briefly mentioned him. He ends up losing the Rob to Zomba, but he takes it to game 5, and after losing to Tilda, he gets wins on Deathspade, MPG, John Numbers, and Jake, which is super impressive. Mass props to him. He's another hidden talent that we have in NA that really doesn't go to a ton of stuff, but whenever he goes, he performs quite well. And then you're going to have Omega, and this guy is one of the future players of America. I can guarantee you that, and this is probably his best tournament to date, at least at the major level. He's able to pick up wins on Jake, Mystery, Tilde, and Jakal, only losing to Tweek and Zomba, but he has a very competitive Game 5 set with Zomba, and he has a chance to become the best Joker player in, honestly, all of the world, but he's easily the best Joker player in America. I should also mention that Jeja ends up getting 33rd with solo Kirby, beating Crafties and Luis, so shouts him for that. So let's get into this top 12, starting with our 9th place finishers. First up is going to be Zomba. We already talked about Zomba. Not a bad performance from him, but it is still an underperformance because he is such a high caliber player. Then you're going to have Lima, who actually ends up beating Zomba, as well as Talking Ben, DM, and Winter Shorts. Shouts to Winter Shorts. And he only loses to SHADIC and MKLEO, taking both of those players to game 5. And Lima is one of the best players in America, easily a top 10 player in America, and I personally have him as the best beta player in the world. I just like the way that he plays the character, and it's undeniable how good Bloom and Tama P are, and I think if Bloom and Tama P had more opportunities to prove themselves, especially Bloom, then maybe I would regard them as the best, but what I've seen from Lima is just genuinely incredible. He's such a talented player, and I like that he camps with Bale. What can I say? You're going to have DD also finishing in 9th place, and this is one of the hidden talents of Smash. I know I said this a lot in this video, but what can I say? NA just showed up this weekend with some of their lesser known players, or I guess lesser established players. You have him beating Danny before he gets upset by Jakal, and we knew this was a possibility. What I didn't expect though was the losers run that Diddy would go on. He 3-1s Aaron, then 3-0s Icy Miss, Tweek, and Riddles before falling to MUTEACE, and MUTEACE is quite good at the Steve matchup, so you can't feel too bad about that one. If DD had the opportunity to travel more and play against these super talented players offline, I could guarantee you he'd be a top 10 player by the end of the year, but he's still extremely young. His time to take the Smash Ultimate crown will come in just a couple years, I'm sure, and our final 9th place finisher is going to be Peemna, and all I can say from this performance is last weekend was 1000% not a fluke, because he looked just as good as he did then. He beat Spickles and Pelka before falling to Spargo, arguably the best player in the world. Then he beat Super Semi and Sinji before falling to Meister, and this is another example of transitive property going in Meister's favor. He beats Mia at Cirque, but then loses to Meister at Collision. Pretty interesting to think about, but overall, Peanut looked phenomenal. As always, the best Mega Man player in the world, and I just really hope that we get to see more of this guy. On to the top 8, starting with our 7th place finishers, the 2 boys from Luminosity, Meister and MKLEO. Meister's going to pick up wins on Arsenic, Jeja, and John Numbers to get into the top 32. Once in the top 32, he manages to make the upset over Riddles, which is so impressive. Prior to 2024, Riddles was 4-0 on Meister. Now it is 2-4 in Riddles' favor. Still Riddles' favor, but Meister's won those last 2 sets. I believe both of them end up going to game 4, and this is kind of expected. Not Riddles losing, but more so Kazuya losing. I think that character is getting continually worse as other characters just get better, because once people start killing you in 2 to 3 interactions like they happen, Kazuya's 1 interaction kill doesn't matter as much because his disadvantage state is so weak, because his neutral is so lackluster that people can just run circles around him and win neutral just 1 or 2 more times and secure the stock. And let's not get it twisted, Kazuya, very broken character. Riddles can absolutely still make him work, but it's just a lot more difficult nowadays. And he ends up losing to ONIN in the winner side, him being Meister, before running into Peanut, and he ends up winning that one 3-0. And that transitive property, it keeps coming up. At Genesis, Raffalo ends up beating Mia, then Meister 3-0s Raffla. At Collision, he ends up beating Peanut 3-0, even after Peanut beats Mia at Cirque du CFL. So, Meister best game watch, I mean, based off that logic, he definitely is. And once in the top 8, he ends up losing once again to Light, another Game 5 set between those guys. And Light is just incredible at that matchup. It's really a coin flip, though. Meister absolutely could have won it, just like he could have won it at Genesis, but this time, Light just came out on top. And the other 7th place finisher is going to be MKLEO, and he keeps up his form from King Kong. Looked really solid at this event, beating Hayes, Beast, and Marcus to get into the top 32. Once in the top 32, he ends up losing a Game 5 set to KOLA, but he 3-0s Cosmos, 3-0s the Buzz, and beats Lima in a Game 5 set before running into MUTEACE. And I don't want to say MUTEACE has MKLEO's number, because I don't think that's the case, but in their last 2 encounters, MUTEACE has 3-0'd him both times, so I'm curious to see how he's going to overcome that. And recently on Twitter, MKLEO was talking about picking up a secondary character. I hope it's a secondary character for Joker, because his Joker has been looking so good recently, and I'm not super sure who it's going to be. I think personally Aegis Joker would be his best character combination on paper. Now, I don't know if he's actually going to do that, because his Aegis hasn't looked amazing in tournament, but that doesn't mean it can't look amazing in tournament. I think if he fully invests in that character, he is going to have a lot of success with her. But to be honest, it's MKLEO. He can really play anyone at the top level and kind of farm, but I hope he keeps working on the Joker, because it is starting to look incredible. On to our 5th place finishers, being MUTEACE and Light. Starting off with MUTEACE, he was able to pick up wins on Bobo, Yoda Cage, and Monty to get into the top 32, going Game 5 versus both Yoda Cage and Monty, so shouts to those players. He ends up beating Sinji before running into Spargo, and Spargo's a player that he's been going back and forth with. Overall, the record is still in his favor, 4-2, but Spargo wins it at Battle of BC, Mute wins it at Rewire Fest, then you're going to have Spargo winning it at Collision, so that means he's bound to win it. And their next encounter, I don't make the rules, I just look at the stats, and in the loser side, he manages to beat both DD and MKLEO before he ends up falling to KOLA. And whenever those guys two plays an absolute banger, I just really like watching MUTEACE play versus sword players because of how good his micro spacing is. And even though he lost to both of the top swordies this time, it doesn't mean that he's going to end up losing next time. And MUTEACE has honestly had a really good start to 2024. I feel like it's been a bit of a quiet one, but he's got 13th at LMBM, 25th at Genesis being his worst placement. Then he's going to end up getting 2nd place at Cirque. Now he's got a 5th place at Collision. It feels like he just has not lost any of his form. I know he's been talking about on Twitter how he hasn't been looking as good recently, but the results, they definitely don't agree with him, even when he's not at 1,000%. This guy's just such a smart player, and if he can't execute, he's just going to beat you in neutral anyway. And our other 5th place finisher is going to be Light. And full bias, Light was easily my favorite player to watch this weekend because every single set this guy in was absolutely electric. He beat Z and Chunky Kong to get into the top 32. And I already talked about how good that Chunky Kong set was. Then once in the top 32, he plays Mars, and that ends up going Game 5. And it's an absolute banger. Then he plays KOLA in another Game 5, and he does end up losing it. But that doesn't change the fact that it was one of the best sets of the tournament. In the loser side, he beats Zomba Game 4, really good set. And then he beats Meister Game 5, amazing set. And he ends up losing to SHADIC in a Game 4, and of course, it was a very good set. And Light's been looking really good recently. He's going to be in that contention for the best player in America, and I'll talk about who the frontrunner is in just a second for the conversation, but now him, Zomba, and Tweek all have inconsistent placements. Zombas aren't going to be as bad, only being a 9th, but Light and Tweek both have a 17th. Light's coming from Cirque, Tweek's coming from this very tournament, and it's a really close race between those guys, but there's someone that's pulling ahead. In 4th place, you're going to have KOLA, and he's also had a really good start to 2024. He's got 17th at LMBM and Genesis, 5th at Invitational, has a slight dip at Cirque du CFL where he ends up getting 25th, but he recovers it immediately at this event with a 4th place, beating Bonk, PK Chris, and Beastly to get into the top 32. Once in the top 32, he beats both MKLEO and Light in Game 5 sets, like I already mentioned, so crazy. Then he's in the top 8, ends up losing a super close Game 5 to ONIN, and we saw the Cloud come out in that set. The Cloud ends up taking a game, and honestly, if he started with the Cloud, there was a very real possibility that he would have won that set, but if ifs and buts were candies, then that's we'd all have a Merry Christmas. Then he's going to end up up falling to the loser side, beating MUTEACE, and then he ends up falling to SHADIC in a Game 5 set. That's 2 Game 5s that these guys have had in 2024, once at Invitational, now at Collision, and he's getting closer every single time, even though both are Game 5. They're both extremely close, and it's only a matter of time before he ends up taking that set. And if KOLA is consistently going to events, I think we're going to see him return to that form where he was in 2021, 2022. I kind of forget the year, but you get the point, when he was absolutely farming, and he is still easily the best Roy player in the world. He's kind of the only one making this character work at the super top level right now. Like, Goblin and Alice are all very good, but they're not even close to reaching the highs that KOLA is able to obtain. The aggression that he has on this character is just sublime, and when you're confident, when you have bravado, you're calling people out and they're dying at 50-60%, it's easy to see why he's having success. And also, I just want to point out that he finally gets his revenge on MKLEO from that one set they played at Glitch, and it's gotta feel good. In third place, you're going to have ONIN, and it wasn't about whether or not ONIN would be back to the top level of Smash Ultimate, it was just when is it going to happen, and the answer is right now. He ends up beating Raptor, MPG, and Tilde to get into the top 32, then he beats Tweek and MAISTER, and I should add, the only player that even took a game off ONIN before the top 8 was MPG, taking 1 game, so shouts to MPG for that. Once in the top 8, he ends up beating KOLA in that really competitive Game 5 set before losing to Spargo and SHADIC 3-0 to both players, and honestly, those are 2 very tricky draws. Both of those characters do extremely well versus Steve, in my opinion, at least going even with the character, even if you want to be super pessimistic about it. That big sword is just kind of difficult for Steve to deal with, and ONIN didn't have a solution this time, but that doesn't mean that he won't next time. And it's not like ONIN completely disappeared off the face of the earth. He was just going to less events, and we haven't seen him top 8 a major since, I believe, Crown, but his results are still solid. The only other major he has in 2024 is a 70 the Genesis, which is still very good, but this is what we're used to seeing from this guy. He's such a talented player, and I wouldn't be surprised if we keep seeing him get these podium finishes as he continues to go to events, because he's one of the best Steve players in the world. He's still the best Steve at using block, and that's obviously a very important aspect of the character. And our second place finisher is going to be SHADIC, and I kind of alluded to it earlier, but he has a very real argument for being the best player in America. And before you get mad at me, let's just look at his result. His worst placement of 2024 is a 9th at LMBM, where he loses to Tweek and Light. And then he picks up a win at King of Bombs, 7th at Genesis, 3rd at Invitational, 1st at Circuit of CFL, and now a 2nd place at Collision. His major win isn't going to be as big as Tweek's or Zomba's, but Zomba is going to have 3 9th place finishers. Tweek is going to have a 17th place. Now, he's unarguably the most consistent player in America, because Light also has a 17th place at Circuit of CFL, and he's got 3 podium finishes in a row. But let's actually talk about this podium finish. He gets a win on Tony Pajamas and Icymus to get into the top 32, and prior to this, he had never beaten Icymus before. I believe it was 3-0 in Icymus' favor, so that's very impressive. He manages to pull off a reverse 3-0 versus Jakal, which is obviously very impressive. Then he beats Lima, who he has lost the last 10 sets to, and the record is 14-3 overall. And also Bayo does very well versus Corrin. Sims also does very well versus Corrin, and that's to get into the top 8. Once in the top 8, he ends up losing to Spargo, but then he beats Light, who had a 5-0 record on him, and Fox also does very well versus Corrin. You're kind of noticing the trend at this point. Then he beats KOLA Game 5, he 3-0s ONIN, and he does end up losing to Spargo in the run back, but he ends up taking games in both of those sets. And SHADIC is just so impressive, and this run is especially impressive. I feel like this was the hardest bracket you could have possibly given SHADIC. Maybe Tweek throwing in there would have been a little bit more difficult, but he had some of his trickiest opponents that he had never beaten before or hadn't beaten in quite some time, and he managed to overcome every single one of them. This kid is so impressive. He is undeniably a top 10 player in the world right now, and honestly wouldn't be surprised if by the end of the season he was in contention for that #1 title. Speaking of the best player in the world, Spargo is going to win the tournament with 0 sets dropped. He's going to end up beating Juanpi and Cosmos to get into the top 32. Once in the top 32, he beats Pimna and MUTEACE. Then it's in the top 8, where he beats SHADIC, ONIN, and SHADIC once again. No sets dropped. Didn't even go Game 5. This was a very dominant win from Spargo, and a very important win, may I add, because there's a lot of people that are in contention for that #1 spot. Not as many as there used to be, because I'd say Tweek used to be in there, and I think he's going to fall out. I think Mia's going to fall out because he's had a couple underperformances. Now, obviously, they still can get it, but as it stands right now, it's between Spargo, Sonics, and KOLA, in my opinion, and KOLA and Sonics just straight up don't have the reps right now. KOLA only has 1 major, which he does win. Sonics only has 2 majors, where he gets 2nd at both. Obviously, they're still doing very well, and they can be the best, but Spargo has 4 majors, and they're all amazing. 3rd at LMBM, 3rd at Genesis, 2nd at King Kong, and now he wins this event with no sets dropped. This is such an important one for Spargo because if he wanted to be the best, he had to win either Collision or Battle of BC, and now that he's won Collision, that is a lot of pressure off his shoulders, and if he wins Battle of BC, I don't want to say he's guaranteed to be the best player in the world because there's a lot of things that can happen, especially with the level of play being as high as it is right now, but he would put himself in a very good spot. He looked incredible at this event. It was pretty much just Cloud. Actually, I think it was solo Cloud, at least from what I saw, which is honestly kind of nice. Doing it with your best character is always something that's super comforting. And I'm curious to see, does the Aegis even need to come out going into Battle of BC? Does the Core need to come out? It's probably going to come out versus Sonics, but we're just going to have to wait and see. And with that, I thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the sport. It's been absolutely unreal as of late. If there's anything I left out, got wrong, or if you just want to say hi, leave a comment down below. Be sure to sub while you're down there, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye!